So I gave some reasons that are often given for why the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe, but why did this happen specifically in Great Britain? Now, there are lots of different explanations for this, and like as most things in history, the right answer is probably a combination of a handful of these things. So first I'll mention is the French Revolution. Britain fought against Napoleon. Napoleon invaded many different states in Europe, but Great Britain was lucky. It was an island, and this somewhat protected it from invasions that continental European states weren't protected from. So, really, by the time the dust had settled on the French Revolution, Britain was already on its way to becoming the first industrial society. Another thing that is mentioned is transportation. So Great Britain is well connected internally by waterways, which facilitated transportation, and later on would be well connected with railroads. Aristocrats, so the traditional landowning class in Britain, were more interested in commerce than in the rest of Europe. The monarchy and merchants were closely linked. So an example of this, the Royal Navy traveled with British merchant fleets to ensure that they were successful in their missions. There's rapidly growing population in Great Britain. Improvements in agriculture meant that fewer people needed to be farmers, so there really was a ready supply of workers. Lots of people needing jobs. The factory was a place where they could work. Other arguments include religious toleration. So some argue that there's a greater degree of religious toleration in Great Britain at this time. They had an attitude where they'd welcome people of skills regardless of faith. And an opposite to this would be France, who persecuted its Protestant minority, drove the Huguenots out of the country, and a lot of them were skilled workers. At the same time, to make factories work, Britain passed legislation that made unions illegal. Still, despite that, some argue that Britain's parliamentary system was the most democratic in Europe at that time, and this greater freedom contributed to more of a culture of innovation. And then finally, there's the issue of natural resources. Great Britain was blessed with a steady supply of coal and iron, which were extremely important in the outset, or in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In 1750, Britain's output of coal was 5.23 million tons, and by 1850, this number was 68.4 million tons. And during this century, agriculture, which had been really the dominant economic sector in virtually every civilization for thousands of years, really shrank in importance as mining and manufacturing became more prominent, more important. By 1914, agriculture employed less than 8% of Great Britain's population, and these jobs had moved to mining, to manufacturing. So, what type of impact did the Industrial Revolution have on the lives of people living in Great Britain? Starting near the top of the social hierarchy with the aristocracy, for a long time, the aristocracy was the dominant class in Great Britain. A few thousand British families owned more than half the farmland, and most of these aristocrats rented the land out to tenant farmers. So that's how aristocrats made their money, and the rapidly growing population in Great Britain meant that there's still a heavy demand for food. But overall, with industrialization, the status of the aristocracy declined, and this is because through the process of industrialization, urban wealth, wealth created in factories, became more important, and the landowning aristocrats really had to make way at the top for businessmen, factory owners, bankers who were made rich by industrialization. With that being said, by no means did landowning aristocrats suffer under industrialization. But undoubtedly, the people that benefited the most from industrialization were the middle class, specifically the upper middle class. Because when we look at the term middle class, it's really a big tent term that really encompasses a whole lot of different people with vastly different incomes. So at the top, you have you have the upper middle class, and this group is made up of mine owners, factory owners, bankers, really prominent merchants. These people often really copied the lifestyle of the old aristocratic class. They'd buy houses in the country, they'd run for parliament, their sons would attend Cambridge or Oxford University. So this is a very wealthy group, but they're still middle class because they don't have that aristocratic background. A much larger part of the middle class was made up of other professionals that were really needed to make an industrial society work. So, small businessmen, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, journalists, scientists, and other professionals. A reform bill in 1832 gave the right to vote to men of middle class, but not to middle class women. Women in the middle class were pushed to the role of homemakers, wives, mothers. Women were expected to maintain the home and give time to charitable events. And you look at this idea of the cult of domesticity. And this is really different in pre-industrial society, where women played a different role in the peasant farm and artisan shop, spent much more time working alongside their husbands. By the late 1800s, middle-class women began entering the workforce as teachers, clerical staff, nurses. As the industrial economy matured in Great Britain, there also emerged something known as the lower middle class. And this was people who worked in mostly service sector jobs, such as clerks, hotel staff, bank tellers, police officers. Socially, this type of work was much more sought after than working in a factory. People wanted to lay claim to the fact that they were middle class, even if it was lower middle class. The overwhelming majority of Britain's 19th century population, 70% or more, were neither aristocrats or members of the middle class. Instead, they were manual workers who worked in mines, ports, factories, the construction sites, the workshops, and the farms of an industrializing Britain. Without a question, it was the laboring classes or working classes who suffered the most and benefited the least from industrialization. A migration that emerges during this period is from the rural areas to urban areas. There are fewer people needed to farm, and jobs were available in factories. So we see this process of mass migration from farms to cities. The turn of the 19th century, for example, London had become the biggest city in the world with over 6 million people. So now we have this concept of the industrial city, big cities full of factories with workers living around the factories. And initially, this created very dirty cities with horrible living conditions. There wasn't adequate sewage, there's no clean water, there's too much garbage lying around, and no proper garbage disposal. So initially, this created very poor living conditions in cities and epidemic diseases springing up because of the poor sanitation. Industrialization dramatically transformed the workday. So before industrialization, farmers usually had busy times of the year and less busy times of the year. But now with industrialization, they were working long hours all the time. Before industrialization, farmers knew when they had to work, and they had to get the job done, but they were still setting their own hours. The same thing goes for artisans who worked in shops before industrialization. Small craftsmen before industrialization were really their own bosses. Work might be mixed with socialization. They might have visitors come during the day, and all of this was okay because they ran their own shop. The model in the factory was completely different. The job, the hours were driven by the factory whistle. The needs to keep machines running in order to stay competitive with other factories. So often this involved long hours, direct, constant supervision, punishments if you're falling out of line, low wages because for the most part, in a factory, skill was really removed from the equation. Anybody could do the jobs, so factory owners didn't have to pay high wages. During this period, we'll see an increase in child labor, many children working in factories. Children were sort of seen as these nimble creatures that could get into hard-to-reach spots, fix machines. Some women worked in factories. Typically, this was before they got married. Often they lived in dormitories around factories before they were married, and they really did the same job as men in factories, but their salary was just a fraction of what men were making. Typically, women didn't continue working in factories after they were married. In industrial Britain, a man who couldn't support his wife was considered a failure. Some women from the working class, did take jobs working as domestic servants for people in the middle class.